So welcome everybody, glad you're here. For today, we're excited to talk about some kind of how-to helpful hints. One of those things where we as architects have to, we all work on the same types of efforts in our processes, and it's always helpful to, whenever we can, put our heads together and about strategies, how we talk about how we do that process our way, and to the benefit of other people, just kind of sharing what works well for each of us. Of course, every project is completely different, and we're always reinventing the wheel to some extent, but especially the process, paperwork, presentation, application type stuff, love to share and see what other people do, and hopefully we can all learn something on how to effectively communicate, put together presentations, also formulate asks and understand what is a reasonable or effective variance, hardship reasoning, and how to communicate that best to the Board of Adjustment, and also probably neighbors or anyone else more wanting to get assistance with or approval from. Our two panelists today are James Legeai, who is an architect who has successfully gone through the variance process last summer, right, with this, is that right?
No, it was last March. So it was about a year and 3 months ago.
Okay, perfect. So James will kind of walk us through the presentation he did as a kind of show and tell on here's the exhibits we prepared, here's the ask. The ask was modified, and kind of those conversations, like a little bit the strategic, just how that worked. And then Will Schnier is an engineer who is, and much more, served on the Board of Adjustment a few years ago. So he is here to speak from the, kind of reviewer side of the conversation, and can give us some insight on, what they found effective or not effective, or just kind of answer questions and share some good insight with us. So let's start with James. Do you want to spend about 10 minutes or so walking through the presentation you did, or submittal materials? Oh, you're muted, James.
That would help. In our office, we call that pulling a mark, is our principle. In our presentation, we were asking for a couple of different things. We had two side-by-side lots. They were both 35 feet wide. So that just on its own, we had to get permission to build on substandard lots. The other two things that we were asking for, one was a permission to get rid of the McMansion setback plane on the interior side yard lots, meaning between the two lots, and then the articulation between the two side yard lots. That's a big ask, asking for those two things. And the biggest balancing act that we found was we kind of had to show, hey, look, we want to build on these two lots, and we can build something here. So we have to show that these lots are similar in nature to all these other lots, and that we can build something here, but also we're asking for all of these additional things. So we have to show that these lots are very unique, and that there's this massive hardship at the same time. So it was kind of a tough balancing act in terms of the presentation. So I'm going to pull that up, because I think that shows kind of best how we started to go through that. And we went to the Board of Adjustments twice. Everybody see my screen? Okay. So the first time that we went to the Board of Adjustments was in January of 2021. So this was during COVID. So everything was online. I believe everything's in person at this point. Is that correct? Does everyone know? Perfect. Great. So online was very difficult. There was a huge learning curve just to do that. So I'm going to ignore all of the problems that we had and the technical difficulties that were involved in that part of the thing, that part of the discussion, because that in itself was a huge learning curve and a massive problem in terms of communication. So we had these two side-by-side lots. They were very thin, and we were attempting to build on both of them. And as I said, they were two sort of substandard lots. They're both 35 feet wide. One of the biggest things we found in terms of sort of pulling together this presentation that was really helpful was showing the context of the neighborhood as we were going through the presentation. They asked a lot of questions about sort of, oh, what about the area around it? What do the other people in the neighborhood think? And so it was really helpful to have both sort of this overall map showing kind of where we were located. And then we also had another map that showed, look, we're not the only substandard lot in this neighborhood. And this was sort of our argument for that first ask to get us to be allowed to build on a substandard lot in the first place. I think that was pretty straightforward, and we didn't have too much trouble with getting that approved. The Board of Adjustment said, in general, you want to build on these substandard lots. They were sold to you as substandard lots. They're 35 feet wide. If you can show us that you can build on them, which we did, that they make sense, and you're not doing anything that's against the rules in order to build on them, then we're fine with that. The biggest problem I think that we had was that we were also asking for the two other items, which was getting rid of the McMansion tent on one side, which was between the two lots, and then also getting rid of articulation in between those two lots. That was a huge discussion point, and that was why this ultimately got pushed back to a second meeting. The presentation that we did do was very helpful, and I think kind of harking back to what we submitted in our application, and just sort of proving that out graphically, that showing our hardship by comparison to a typical lot was really helpful, to express that a typical lot has 20 feet at 30 feet high, and we have 4.5 feet, right? So very clearly we're at a disadvantage in terms of what we're able to build on our lot because of the tent. And that allowed us, I think, some leeway, but it wasn't a major push enough, I think, to get us sort of that approval. Once we got into sort of the 3D elements and sort of showing them, this is what we are allowed to build currently, and this is sort of the additional area if we were allowed to have this tent portion removed. Our sort of goal was to show, hey, we're not asking for a whole lot more. The difference in terms of how this impacts the neighborhood visually when you're walking by it on the street is not a whole lot. That was a useful argument, because that is generally their biggest concern. They seem to not want to, create a precedent, which was a big concern, obviously. That didn't seem to be too much of a problem on this in particular lot, because we had two side-by-side lots that were both 35 feet wide with a single owner. That's not going to happen all that often. But getting rid of the McMansion tent altogether was a precedent that they did not want to set. And as we went through, sorry, I skipped through a couple. As we went through this and we finally got to sort of what we wanted to ask for at the end, and I think reiterating this at the end really helped in our presentation, asking for the permission to build removal of the side yard setback, and removal of sidewall articulation. These two, they had such a problem with that when we went back and thought about it, and we were also asked to do a sort of a more developed site plan for the next meeting. That was one ask that they had for us. We also looked at what we could live with if we were to sort of self-edit these asks. And what we ended up coming back with for the second presentation, instead of trying to modify this entire presentation and do a whole other rigmarole of going through this again, what we ended up doing was we just came back with saying, look, here is our more developed site plan with sort of what we would generally build. And this was not exactly what we built, but it honestly wasn't that far off because we were fairly limited in terms of what we could build on a site like this. And we have two houses that are side by side. So one of them, one of the plans really does reflect this still currently. It's being built as we speak. The thing that we asked for, or ended up asking for, instead of removing the entire tent all the way across, we said, look, this is broken into, you know, these 40-foot sections. So why don't we have the second section removed? Because frankly, that helps us a lot more because that's where we're gonna be able to utilize it the most. And it has less of an impact on the street presence. From their perspective, that was really helpful because walking down the street, that's, you know, almost 60 feet back. So it's way less of an impact on the neighborhood. And from our perspective, that's where we would want to put it anyway. So we don't really need this tent. We don't need this tent. We don't need a tent back here. And so it kind of worked in both of our favors. So being able to self-edit helped, and they actually bought that. And so we were able to get rid of this middle tent, and that's what we ended up getting approved. The second part of that was the articulation, and this argument I honestly did not think was going to fly, but it ended up working. And what we did was we had said that our lot is about 35 feet wide. A typical lot is 50 feet wide, which means our buildable area is about 25 feet wide, whereas a typical buildable area is about 40 feet wide. The standard articulation is 4 feet, right, on either side. So that's 10% of 40. So I said, well, what if we did 10% of 25 and we only went in 2.5 feet? And we said, we'll do our we'll meet our articulation, but we'll only do it as 2.5 feet instead of the full 4 feet, because that's 10% of the lot. And so it meets the sort of spirit of the law or the rule. And they were like, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense for this, you know, for this size lot. And like, that's what we showed kind of here. It's like we would do, you know, 2.5 feet, and they were cool with that. So we ended up getting both of those approved as a result of that. I don't think that if we would have come back with a developed site plan and still asked for either of those things as full requests, that either of them would have gotten fully approved.
James, sorry to interrupt you.
There's just no way they would have gotten approved.
James, sorry to interrupt you. Could you show that site plan?
Oh, I'm sorry. I had thought I was showing my full screen, but I guess I was just showing the window.
Great, thank you.
Apologies for that. Okay, so this is our more developed site plan. So you can see that we were still kind of asking for the full articulation requirement removal, and we just verbally talked about when it seemed to be going in the direction of like, I don't think that they're going to go for this, that we asked, hey, how about the 10% rule? And then for the second McMansion tent, that's kind of what we started out with. We said, hey, look, you know, this is going to be way less impactful in the neighborhood because it's so far back from the street. You're already starting at the property line plus the curb. you're already 25-foot setback plus another 40 feet. We're talking about way back here. And this is where we would want to break that tent anyway. And again, for us, it made the most sense because that's where we would want to do that regardless, because that's where we're going to put our attic exempt space in one of those lots, go up in that area. For the articulation, going in 2.5 feet just allowed us a little more flexibility, because going in 4 feet for a 25-foot wide lot gets you to like 16. It's just way too tight.
For that articulation, was coming up with the 10% argument, was that something you had in your back pocket, or did you come up with it on the fly?
No, we had it in our back pocket. No, I can't do math that quick. I'm an architect, not an engineer, so I had to figure that math out on paper. So, like with a calculator, yeah. So
you're a pretty good architect, but not that good.
Yeah. So we showed them this, and then the meeting was simply this and this, and this was it for that second meeting. And then we even like listed out in this one that we just wanted the second McMansion tent, and then the removal of the sidewall articulation. But again, we sort of talked through that one, and that's what they ended up writing as their as the ruling. It's the ruling for the adjustment. So that's sort of the process that we went through. I think the biggest things they found again is that like the big ask that we went for, they didn't want to set a precedent, and so we tried to find ways that we could get around setting a precedent by creating these sort of unique conditions for asking for like sort of parts within that got removed rather than sort of the whole thing getting taken away. That worked for us, and that seemed to be nice. And again, I think showing those 3D examples and everything in the first one really helped. But in the second one, the second meeting, I think just having that conversation around reducing what we were asking for helped just from a negotiation tactic, right? Just like, oh, hey, I know we put all this on the table, but hey, but we asked for a little bit less. And they were sort of like, oh yeah, a little bit less sounds good. That worked really well. We didn't really mean to do that, but it worked out in our favor, so we'll take it.
That's super helpful, and I like seeing the this summary here, and also the illustration of, although you said it wasn't as effective for this one, but the illustration of typical versus your case is, I think, a good way to explain the hardship visually, rather than just saying, believe me, there's a hardship, and verbally explaining why. Just kind of that visual diagram is nice.
Yeah, that was actually really helpful in the first meeting, and they did understand that, hey, we do have a legitimate hardship, and that's why they didn't just deny it. That's why they pushed us back and asked for a site plan to see what we would be developing, because they were like, look, we see that there's something there, and that's what at least got us to the second meeting. If we wouldn't have had the visuals, I don't know if we would have gotten to this. I think they would have just denied us flat out, or at least would have approved that we could build on these substantial lots, and then not said, there's no way we're going to approve these other two things.
That makes sense. Yeah. Thanks, James. That's awesome.
Yeah. Thank you guys.
Yeah. And we'll have more Q&A time also after. I'm sure there'll be more questions. Will, do you want to talk about your experience on the Board of Adjustment and give us your valuable insight?
My take.
What should architects know that they don't?
Well, I thought James's presentation was excellent. I'd say, well, my first question for James is, did they make you do 2 cases? Was it actually 2 cases, 1 per lot, or did they let you do 1 case for both lots?
So it's 2 cases, but we presented them simultaneously, and we just said, hey, we're going to present both of these at the same time. They were kind of weird about how we grouped our time together, so we pretty much had to do it in the 5 minutes, but that was fine.
Yeah, yeah.
It worked out.
At the Board of Adjustment, there's a few unique things about it. The first one is you cannot lobby the Board of Adjustment members prior to the hearing. And that is, I know why they do it, but that is in complete contrast to Planning Commission or Zoning and Planning Commission or City Council. As professionals, whether you're an architect or an engineer, or an expediter, you don't ever want to put yourself in the position of going to a public hearing and not having a good sense of, or an exact sense of the answer you're going to get when you're there. When you're going to City Council or Planning Commission, you can vote count ahead of time and know whose support you have, because if you've done your homework, you've been talking to them or their staff behind the scenes. You cannot do that at the Board of Adjustment. So that makes that a challenge. Another challenging thing with the Board of Adjustment, and James did a great job of hitting on it, is you must demonstrate a hardship. And the caveat, there's two caveats to demonstrating a hardship. The first is it cannot be financial. So you can't just want to make more money, or you can't say I overpaid for the land. I need to put more stuff on it. So it can't be financial, and it has to be unique to your immediate area. In this case, the narrow lots were based on the map he showed. I know, James, you showed a zoomed out one where there were a few more substandard lots, but on your immediate block, you were the only two I could see that had that hardship. So that was, that to me was a very, you did a great job demonstrating the hardship, which should have gone quickly. And now your first variance was taken care of. Now you said you spent 2 meetings on the second 2 issues, and I can see why. You also mentioned you did a neighborhood survey, you solicited neighborhood feedback. I assume very few to 0 neighbors were emailing the Board of Adjustment or showing up at the public comment period at the hearing to contest you. Maybe there were, but having neighborhood support, having a silent neighborhood is great, meaning they're not there and don't email anything. That's your baseline. Having neighborhood support is even better. I know, even though I said you had to demonstrate a hardship, having neighborhood support also takes a little bit of the heat off of people who are volunteer officials, so to speak. They're not paid to do this. They didn't run for this seat. In my case, and in most people's cases, they're basically harassed by a council member to fill the seat because it's a thankless position and it goes well past midnight regularly.
Yeah. Well, would you say by neighborhood support, is it like individual property owners adjacent, or if there's a neighborhood group, does that matter, or is it really just who's going to have to look at the thing? Okay.
If you're in a neighborhood planning area, you certainly want the neighborhood planning contact team to support it, within the guise of their neighborhood plan. You never want to ask for a variance unless you have a real hardship if your neighbor is opposed to it. Obviously James put together a professional presentation, but for those of you who have not been to Board of Adjustment, it's on television. The historic episodes are there. You can go watch it. I bet 90% of the cases are homeowners with a carport or a fence or a shed or a pool or something that's in violation of the code, and they're asking for forgiveness. And they really struggle. The hardship in most of those cases for existing homeowners is you bought a house that had this problem and then it got flagged, so you didn't create the problem. That's your hardship. The people who are smart enough to hire an architect or an engineer or an expediter or an attorney, they, like James, they put together a whole presentation and they get raked over the coals. They actually don't have as much sympathy as the homeowner with the carport and the front building setback, for example. which drove me nuts. I tended to be a private property rights commissioner, and I wanted to find a reason to support the variance. And we were probably, at my tenure, this was 2014, 2015, evenly split, about half the group. Jeff Jack was on there with me. For those of you that know Jeff, he is not prone to want to approve variances, especially in residential areas. But I tried to find a reason to approve people's variances, especially when they had the presentation and the reasoning outlined. James had another thing going for him in that the person, his variance request, well, he needed a variance, and the person, the need for the variance was trying to protect was himself. Was the same owner on the other side of the line. James wasn't asking for a tent reduction on, the property line where his client didn't own the other side of the property line. And I think that probably worked in his favor too. And I started off saying it couldn't be a financial hardship, but how can you build a big enough house on a 3,000 foot lot? I don't know how big it was, James, with Austin's prices these days, to justify, buying the lot in the first place. And that argument you can use, cautiously. I'd say it would work on me, but by the letter of the law, it should not work. Because the city would argue that everyone in Austin would have a similar argument in that case. You can take or leave that argument, but
we just when that came up, we didn't ask, we just said, hey, we want the same rights as everyone else in the neighborhood, right? That they can build this to this extent, and so we want to be able to build to the same extent as everyone else in the neighborhood, which we felt was equitable.
Yep.
And some of them bought that, some of them didn't, but enough that it worked. So
the other thing I would just kind of tell you guys is James said he got postponed by the commission, by the commissioner. So that he went to the first meeting, they were willing to accept the lot size variance. And he said a couple of times we were fortunate that they postponed us and allowed us to come back. If you get to the point where you get a no vote, you're out for a year before you can come back, just so you know. And the applicant can request, if you think that vote's coming down and it's against you, the applicant can request one time, and it's almost always granted a 30-day postponement to retool your argument before you come back. So that would save you 11 months of waiting before you can come back if a rejection is pending. And that's something to keep in your pocket, because depending how your presentation goes, how the night's gone for the commissioners, what commissioner happens to be vocal that night, you may or may not be postponed versus rejected. And you really don't want to be rejected, again, for the year-long hiatus period. And it's expensive. I don't know what you paid, James, but I bet it was close to $600 or $700 to go to the hearing.
I didn't pay anything.
Well, your client, you added 10% and passed it through. So, that's kind of my guidance based on what I saw from James. I thought his variance was very well thought out and reasonable. And there's a lot of, I don't know where Fletcher is, but there's a lot of substandard lots on the east side also. There's some in South Austin, but on the east side of Austin, there's a lot of narrow lots. And if they're not in a special zoning area, you don't have exceptions, and you're going to be forced to go to the Board of Adjustment. I think you'll see more of that in the future. One more thing. I don't know if anyone at the city, some of the staff is greener than usual, James, and you were also on a remote setting, but the more experienced people at the city might counsel you that if you're not asking for a full variance from the code and it's only a partial relaxation, you could go to Planning Commission. So you might have had to do your first variance at Board of Adjustment, but because you didn't ask for a full tent relaxation or a full articulation relaxation, you might have been able to take those to Planning Commission for those variances. And Planning Commission's different. Those almost everyone on Planning Commission wants to be an elected city council member, so they'll work with you and they're lobbyable. And to me, it's a much different ballgame at Planning Commission than Board of Adjustment. They tend, if you look at Planning Commission, I don't know what the current makeup is now, but I assume at least half of them are real estate practitioners in some sense, whether they're agents or developers or landlords or architects or engineers. They get land use and they get the need for variances and why the city code is what it is and why it's as difficult as it is. So Kim, I'll stop there and answer any questions y'all may have.
That's great. Yeah. I have one question to start off with is, are there any particular visuals that are most helpful? Like I have more experience with City of Westlake, which is of course very different, but they want to see a rendering of what the project looks like from the street, the pretty picture. And it's pretty subjective. Obviously City of Austin is not that way. It's more objective. Like one thing I noticed about James's presentation is that you don't know what the houses look like that he's designed. It's more factual and objective and diagrammatic. And is that fine with everybody? You're supposed to be that way, I think. Does it help to have a pretty picture rendering or more visuals or fewer visuals? What's your take on that?
Case by case. In James's case, I'm not sure I would have shown a rendering with materials and how the facade actually looked from the street, because it would be distracting. He was talking about a tent and a buildable area. In other cases, and y'all may or may not get into this, especially on the residential side, but on the commercial side, sign variances are a big deal. And wanting to get the sign above tree lines or power lines or things like that. In that case, photos are very important. Another common one is, the rich guys on Lake Austin, where their lot slopes 200 feet from the road to the lake. And they've got to build a 10-foot fence, because you can jump from the high side over the low side because it falls so quickly. In that case, pictures of the physical environment are important. You're limited at 6 feet on a fence without a variance. And some of these fences justifiably need 10, 12, 14-foot barriers for safety, not just privacy. Privacy is not really an argument for a variance, but safety is. And, with the right topographic situation, a 10-foot fence could be reduced to 5 or 6 in a heartbeat, especially for, teenage kids jumping over them. So it's really case by case. I remember a distinct case was for us, 2 of them were sign ordinances. One was the Honda dealership on Shoal Creek and Far West. If y'all know where that is, it's behind the Lowe's over there. They actually don't have frontage on Mopac, but they wanted a sign high enough off Shoal Creek that you could see it from Mopac. And their argument was, oh, there's an overpass, going over Mopac, and people dip under and they can't see it till after they exit. I think I led that argument, and I said, well, if you wanted a sign on Mopac, you needed to get frontage on Mopac, not on Shoal Creek. Someone on Shoal Creek can see your sign just fine, and if you put it that high, no one on Shoal Creek could see it. The other one was the Link Shopping Center at 2222 and I-35, and it recently got redeveloped. It was where the old La Bear nightclub was for years back in the 2000s. And visibility at that intersection is brutal with the flyovers from 2222 and I-35. And they actually came back 3 or 4 times with more and more renderings and pictures, and they flew drones, you know, showing us from different parts of the highway and roads what you could see for the proposed signs. And then they went back into the neighborhood and showed us that you couldn't see the signs from the neighborhood streets that they were trying to protect. And we actually, if you go to the Link Shopping Center today, they've got 6 or 7 signs way up in the air. It's a big, narrow site along I-35. And I think we approved all but 2 of their signs. And they had an architect, I think it was Gensler, and they had a land use attorney who was spearheading the variance request. But to me, there was a hardship, and to our commission, there was a hardship. We just had to, we were forcing them to give us the ammunition to approve it so that if a member of the public complained, there was enough justification for the hardship. And that we had protected what the sign ordinance was trying to protect, which was the interior neighborhood, the visibility from the neighborhood. You know, so those are 2 examples of when you may want diagrams and not. But in like James's case, you know, he did well by not giving them more information than they needed to make the decision. You know, you mentioned Westlake. I didn't serve on Westlake, but I've taken plenty of cases through double-digit public hearings trying to get things approved. And at this point, 25 years into my career, I actually refuse to do work in Westlake. I know that's hard for fancy architects, but for the engineer, I'm not missing out on anything. Cutting Westlake and rolling wood out of my career.
Well, I know from our perspective, the 2 of the reasons that we didn't want to do anything more developed. The first was that we didn't have anything more developed, because, you know, we do this variance super early in the project. We're not going to design the building if we don't know the full parameters. So, like, without knowing whether or not we're going to have a tent on one side or articulation or whatever, we don't even know we don't know what design, because we don't know what we're going to be able to utilize or not. And then the other reason is that we don't want to show the Board of Adjustments or have something approved that's on the record that looks a certain way and that's approved, or it has a plan that is approved a certain way, and then have to meet that exact thing when we go to submit our building permit and have it come back to us and say, oh, this doesn't look like what you got approved. And it's like, well, yeah, because we designed it after we got it approved. You know, you run into that problem, or you can potentially run into that problem, but that's something that's always a concern for us. So we try in our presentation for City of Austin, you know, we never want to put that much information. City of Westlake's a little bit different, because we've usually already developed to the plans to a certain point with the client that they're like, hey, this is exactly what we want. So we know exactly what we're asking for. City of Austin's usually a little more generic in terms of that. And we were working with developers on this one. So it was like, hey, we want more square footage. Like, okay, well, here's how you get more square footage. Easy.
You can't use that at the board, though.
Yeah, no.
That's right.
I know why you went there, James. You just can't say it out loud.
James, I want to touch on something, and we also have a question in the chat. So you mentioned you were working for a developer. Was there a discussion at the board? You know, right now you have 2 owners that are the same, but you're asking for, or you were asking for, sidewall articulation to be lessened is what you ended up with. Was there ever a discussion about, okay, well, these are currently owned by one person, but eventually they're going to sell them. We know who they are. They're a developer.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I mean, they saw through it being owned by one person immediately. They obviously knew as a developer, we were architects and we were going to sell them. And that was the whole point. But our discussion centered around, when we go to sell these, the people who are going to buy them know what they're getting.
That's right.
They are going to look at these. There are 2 houses side by side, built by the same developer, and they're walking in with the expectation that this is their next door neighbor, and this is what their next door neighbor looks like. And if this house gets torn down and someone else has to build, something next to it, they have to meet the original articulation requirements because they don't have the same ruling, right? They have to build something new because it's not for this building permit. So, they seem to think that made sense, and we thought that was a reasonable request as well.
That's something important that James just hit on. Your variance is running with your permit. If your permit expires, your variance is gone too.
Will you
Whether it's your application that expires or a granted permit that expires, what is it? Are they 3 years still?
something like that? Will, you kind of nodded your head when James said something about knowing what you're getting. Is that something that's important to the board of knowing, the neighbors or someone who's, in the future going to buy the lot, they have the foresight to know what's there because it's either already built or it's already understood what can be built on those lots.
Yes, and phrased another way, it would say, we're not trying to protect the person who builds from the developer or who buys from the builder, right? We're trying to protect the neutral neighbor on the other side. And he didn't ask,
Gotcha.
he didn't ask for a variance of any kind on the neutral neighbors who were just there going about their day, whether they're owned or rented. But yeah, the future buyer of either of those Fletcher properties is not being harmed. They see,
right.
There's nothing that happens after they buy the house that makes them worse off than before they bought it.
Okay.
Whereas if he asked for the articulation variance on the neutral side, well, that neighbor is potentially harmed in a way that the zoning code was meant to protect him.
Sure. I want to read these couple questions we have in the chat from Blair. Will, can you give examples of some edgy variances that have been granted? It's a long process to undertake frivolously, but being too timid can be a mistake too. Embolden us to ask.
Edgy meaning on the edge of a property, or edgy meaning questionable to approve?
I would say it's probably questionable to approve is what she meant. Or me, I'm not sure.
Very few that are asking permission with a professional that are questionable to approve end up coming through approved. The political will may be there at this point, but it certainly wasn't in 2013, 2014, 2015 for rear detached dwelling units, which could be used for short-term rentals. One of the things the city talks about in broad strokes is we want to encourage ADUs so that people don't get priced out of their home, and they might be able to put either their own family members or a rental unit back there to generate income to help them stay in their home. And there's all kinds of ordinances that want to encourage that, especially in urban infill neighborhoods. If Code Next gets passed, many more lots around the city would have that encouragement. But where that really gets tricky is when you're on a street side yard, or your backyard is also a street, meaning you don't have a neighbor behind you. So your rear setback, instead of being 5 feet, might be 10 or 15 or 25 feet. And so people will ask, if you have a street side yard setback that's 10 feet or 15 feet, depending on your zoning district, or a rear side yard setback that's 10 or 15 or 25 feet, people will ask for that variance to build an ADU, and they'll do the same thing James did and make the hardship, that this lot's unique because we're on a street side yard instead of in a landlocked lot. Or we have a public street in both our front yard and our backyard. And the commission will try to, that's very questionable. Those setbacks probably made sense in the 50s and 60s, but don't in 2020. but they'll do strange fishy things, and it'll be things like, okay, we'll grant the variance for the ADU, but it can't be used as a STR type 2 rental. Meaning you can't rent it on Airbnb, but you could rent it for, you know, a 6-month or a year-long lease to anyone you wanted. And I tended to go along with those when I was on the board, but I never volunteered them because, again, to me, it's a taking of private property rights. If the variance is good for a year-long lease, the variance should be fine for a 3-night lease on Airbnb too, right? But that, despite what the city says in trying to increase affordability, they are certainly not willing to, ransack the single-family neighborhoods. They hold these single-family neighborhoods sacred, which does nothing to help affordability. They try to push it to the commercial corridors, but then you just get, 4-story apartment wraps with the precast garage tacked on the side.
Can I try to rephrase part of my question there? Maybe I'm just looking for a way that, it sounds like financial hardship sounds like a big umbrella, and it might stop me from asking at all. Might recommend to a client we don't go down this hard process, because in the end, even some of what I've seen in James's presentation, you could construe as, well, financial, because you don't need to build a 1 to 2-story house. So wherein is a variance ask that might surprise us, that it's really not such a difficult ask? It's just, you didn't know to ask. Some things that might get through that people leave on the table by not even trying.
Trees is a big one.
Okay.
Almost every day of the week, the Board of Adjustments will want to grant a variance to save a significant tree. So they will allow you to move into a setback to provide a buffer from a tree or preserve a tree.
Oh, wow.
Another one is a non-complying structure on a neighboring lot. So if you have a neighbor who's got a garage or a shed or a building, which is not uncommon, a house, on the property line, and you can't build up to your whole setback because you need to stay off their physical building, well, that's actually a hardship that's unique to your lot, that's caused by the neighbor. So, that would be one. Odd-shaped lots, Blair, is another one. Every once in a while, you see triangular-shaped lots or something that are real strange, where it would aesthetically for the neighborhood meet the intent of the code more to allow a variance into the setbacks than to build a triangular-shaped structure or an oddly-shaped structure. Creeks are another one. Be thinking about, again, it's not financial, but unique to the lot or unique to the property that other homes in the immediate area are not subjected to.
Will, would it be
cell phone
go ahead,
towers could be one. Cell phone towers.
In the case of James's variance request, I'm thinking particularly of the diagram that you did where you showed allowable area that was outside of the tent. If you had to create the full thing with the 2 edges, would it be considered a financial hardship if it were, how do I phrase this? Because it was allowable area and he's not asking for more area on top of that, would it not be considered a financial hardship? The area he's supposed to get but can't because of the tent.
Yes, and James, I assume you made the argument that the tent was imposed by your narrow lot. So you granted the lot variance first. Now, because you granted that, the tent should relax. The second argument he probably used is, well, the tent is also being triggered because of the property that I also own. Meaning one side of his Fletcher property was causing a restriction on the other property that he also owned, and he was trying to waive it amongst himself.
Correct. We're trying to protect ourselves from ourselves.
Yeah. Which is why neighbor, those 8-foot fence variance requests, whether, if they have an architect, it might be a wall and not a wood picket fence, but an 8-foot wall you know, if you have the neighbors' support and they actually want the 8-foot wall or fence, those are almost always granted just to get them off the agenda and through. What people run into is they illegally build the 8-foot fence. They don't have permission. Then they get busted by the neighbor who reports them to code enforcement. Then the neighbor's already pissed at them, you know, and the argument is, oh, well, if you don't grant my variance, I have to chop 2 feet off the top of my fence. And you can find video, a lot of times the Board of Adjustment will tell them to take the 2 feet off the top of their fence, which is tough.
Hey, Will, I actually have a question about that, if I can jump in. For fence variances, or at least for fences going up to 8 feet, can't you just submit a written request that has both owners' permission, or like both owners? Because I know that's in the LDC, right? That you can have a written request that has the permission of sort of the other neighbor that says, yes, you can build up to 8 feet, and you could submit that and get that approved.
On the
You have to
common
submit that
property,
through the, yeah.
on the common property line, yes, James. If
Mhm.
both neighbors support it, it can be administrative. Where it can never be administrative is when it's the property line is on the right-of-way side. So think your corner lot, that side yard that's on the side street, that's coming to Board of Adjustment. And if the neighbor opposes it or doesn't want it, and it's typically not the neighbor, it's an HOA. Which, you know how those go. All these new subdivisions with their HOAs. Granted, the city does not enforce HOA restrictions. The city does not enforce or care about deed restrictions that the city did not participate in. And if you try to bring them up at the Board of Adjustment, very rarely will they even entertain those things. So an HOA needs to enforce their ordinances against you in a civil court, not at Board of Adjustment or code enforcement. It's possible to be completely compliant with the City of Austin code and in violation of an HOA restriction.
We've got another question in the chat. Is it worth coming to a variance meeting requesting permission for a larger massing than the goal massing, so that there's something to cut back or sacrifice to get the goal massing?
Well, I think James did that to some extent. And I would say yes, but it doesn't make sense if you don't have the underlying hardship in the first place.
I would ask James, did you do it on purpose, or did you postpone and come up with a new plan?
No, we postponed. It came from the new plan.
Okay.
We actually, what we did was we postponed. We developed the site plan a little bit more. We figured out what we could live with in terms of the actual developable site plan. And then we said, all right, well, let's go back with this request, which was really helpful because we were able to actually get it approved. So it worked out, but yeah, it would have been really helpful to do that first thing. I just walked in with that back pocket, but I don't know if it was, if it would have worked if we would have gone to them with that request in the first place and said, this is all we're asking for, or if it was better to have gone with the initial request and then said, oh, we're actually pulling it back to this. You know, whether, who knows, that may depend on how they were feeling that day and how they were feeling on the second meeting. Yeah, how much they had to drink before the first meeting, how much they had to drink for the second meeting.
Sure. So I want to tell everybody we're almost at our time here. There is another question in the chat, and then I have a question as well. But if y'all have to drop off, we're coming close to 1 o'clock. The question from Sophia is, are heritage trees with over 50% of the CRZ in the street and outside of your property line a hardship, or do you just have to respect that and not build any further into the CRZ?
It depends. You know, if it's in the front yard and you have a 25-foot front yard setback, it's probably not going to be that big of a hardship. If it's in the side yard and it's a 50-foot lot and you're eating away 25 feet of the side yard when it would have normally been 5, that's a huge hardship to allow someone to either move it forward, violating the front yard setback, or move it backwards, violating a rear setback.
Will, are
Blair
trees
was on and he asked
considered,
about other hardships. Some other hardships for Blair would have been easements that are not unique to the subdivision. Like if there was a big Austin Energy easement there, or drainage easement of some sort would be reasons to have a hardship. But the placement of the tree relative to what you're already permitted to do would be a case-by-case basis. I would never hesitate to use a heritage tree as an argument if you're an applicant, ever.
is
This is
there
Austin.
a hard and fast line about things that are unique enough to be considered hardships? I'm thinking about what you said earlier of, well, you know, let's say for the sake of discussion that you bought an empty lot that's got a bunch of trees on it. You knew where those trees are before you bought that lot. Why would that make it a hardship? Since you already knew that they were there, you knew you were going to have this problem when you bought it. Why is that not a financial hardship?
And you will hear commissioners try to make that argument. Common replies to that will be the lot's unbuildable if we don't deal with the trees, or here's one. There was a house there that encroached in the 50% critical root zone, and you want to demolish it and build a new one in the same footprint, but the new rules wouldn't allow you to, would be one. Or there's a slab there, or a patio slab, or the driveway goes right through the tree's root zone. You got to get creative in that case. You know, you don't want to buy a forest of 25-inch live oaks and try to clear cut it. It'll never work. But we've even gotten commercial variances on commercial projects for heritage trees that allowed us to violate a front yard setback in order to preserve a tree on the side yard that we knew was there. And they love to say that, but they also don't want to get up there and reject you outright if there's a room to necessarily grant the variance without setting precedent. Someone asked about setting precedent. They don't ever want to set precedent. They want to make everything unique to the site. And you got to find a way to help them make it unique to the site, to give them political cover. I mean, that's what it is, political cover to approve the variance and move on and not have their life disrupted by people who are upset about it, you know, for the next 3 weeks or a month.
Sure.
What the famous phrase is, all land use is politics and all politics is local. And variances can be very hyper local and very political.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I have one other question. James, how long did it take you to put together the presentation and to go through the steps, first to figure out that you needed a variance, and then from the time you figured it out to the time it was granted, from a sense of, could you ballpark us how much we should be preparing our clients to be spending on this? Yeah.
It took me
6
10
months.
minutes to explain to Jacob what to make. And then I don't know, it took him maybe probably say 8 to 12 hours for everything. I mean, it really wasn't that complicated because most of it was just diagrams.
But how
Right,
long,
and we
how
had
long
already-
from when
we
you
had already
needed
have
the
the site.
variance to when it was approved?
From when we knew we needed a variance to when it actually got approved. So we knew that we needed a variance, and we submitted for it in, I know we got it approved in March. So let me tell you when we submitted it.
I would
I'll give you-
estimate 4, 5, 6 months from you need a variance to final approval.
Sure.
Well, then that's a better answer than me jumping in and looking through our file system and telling you how long it took us.
And he was postponed once, which was probably for a month and not just 2 weeks.
Yeah, so we were postponed. So during COVID, we were postponed for the first meeting. We went back for the second meeting. The second meeting was actually postponed again, but not because of us, but because of technology. And the city had dropped like 6 people off the call or something, and they couldn't figure it out. And they were like, "Oh, we can't figure this out. We're just going to cancel the meeting. We'll have it next month." And we were like, "Can't have it like in a week or so?" And they were like, "No, it's already scheduled for next month. We'll just have it then." I got a very angry call from the client right after that, explaining to me how much money in taxes he's paying each month for the lots that are empty. But you know, they ended up being fine with it. But yeah, so it does, and especially for the clients who are sitting there waiting to build on these lots, you have to ask whether or not it's worth it for them. For the developer, in this case, it's worth it because they're making all their profit off of, you know, that last amount of square footage, and so they need all of that in order to build to this full extent, and so it's worth it for them to wait those X number of months. And we also started this, you know, you can also start these, and depending on kind of when you submit them, you can start looking at applying for a variance the second that your client brings you a lot that they're looking at, you know, before they've even bought it. And we do that a lot. We do site plan exemptions. The second people start saying, "Hey, we're looking at this lot. What do you think?" We're like, "Let's start the site plan exemption right now." Don't even bother, you know, worrying about that. So timing wise, that's about what it took. And then in terms of our time, I mean, it was really just the time it took for us to pull the presentation together, which probably in total it took maybe about a week of work. That included sort of the time for us to write the presentation and come up with the argument and then actually go to the meeting. You
mentioned Mark earlier. You know, the very first project I ever worked on with Mark needed 5 planning commission variances. Nothing, this was 2005. Nothing gets Mark more excited than the prospect of going to get variances.
Oh, you have no idea.
That's true.
No idea. Loopholes, just loopholes in general. Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, this is a great discussion. And I think one of the really good takeaways, especially, is to help the Board of Adjustment members answer the questions that they will get asked. You know, what they're held accountable for is, you know, why is this a hardship? Why is this unique? Why is it not detrimental to anybody else? And so kind of what we saw in the presentation of bullet points of, you know, kind of providing those answers to the Board of Adjustment, because it's their job to vet it and make the, you know, have the discernment to make that judgment call. But giving, like, kind of feeding those answers and making them clear and easy to process is a good strategy. Making it kind of about them, really, you know, what are you looking for in your concerns, which is nice. It's a good strategy. Thank you guys so much for your time and your expertise and your insight. I think everybody learned a lot.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you guys for having us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having lowly engineer at your AIA meeting.
We appreciate
Necessary
having someone
evil
besides an
concerns.
architect.
Yeah,
No
we
offense.
made an exception this time around. We won't be so nice the next time.
That's right. Yeah, thank you guys so much making the technology work and
Thanks,
getting us
everyone.
organized. Yeah,
Happy Monday.
everybody have a good week. Yeah.